They always say dusk is the most dangerous time in a place like Chickamauga. Something about the way the sun bleeds over the hills, how the trees lean closer together like they're whispering secrets from 1863. But I've driven this road more times than I can count, and I've never had reason to believe any of those stories. Until that night. I was alone in my Ranger truck, just starting my final sweep of the evening. The battlefield road curved ahead, lined with old monuments and those weathered stone markers that sprout like crooked teeth from the earth. I had the windows cracked and the radio tuned to the park's historical audio tour, something I'd heard dozens of times before. Still, I liked the company of the narrator's calm, authoritative voice. It kept the silence from sinking too deep into the cab. "Now approaching the eastern ridge," the voice said. "This area witnessed some of the fiercest fighting during the Battle of Chickamauga. Thousands died in these fields, their bodies left for days before they could be buried. Some say not all of them ever were." I reached for my coffee thermos and smirked. Here it comes. One of the more enduring local legends speaks of Old Green Eyes, a Confederate soldier decapitated by cannon fire. His body was buried, but the head never recovered. Some claim to see glowing green eyes floating in the mist after dark, searching for what was lost. I chuckled, shaking my head as I turned onto the stretch known as Battlefield Loop. That story had been passed around for generations. I'd heard veterans, volunteers, even tourists ask about it. It was harmless, the kind of folklore that added spice to the job. Still, the narrator's voice lingered in my ears longer than usual. A breeze shifted through the cracked window, carrying with it the faint scent of moss and iron. I slowed the truck near one of the older monuments, a lichen-covered stone obelisk honoring the 24th Battalion. The trees above had begun to knit together, forming a tunnel of shadow. My headlights cast long, skeletal beams across the gravel pull-off. I parked under the canopy of oaks and took a breath. Routine. Nothing unusual. I did this every week. But that night, something gnawed at the edge of my thoughts, like I'd stepped into a painting, and the sky had changed colors without telling me why. I turned off the engine but kept the radio running. The narrator moved on, droning about troop movements and flanking tactics. I wasn't really listening anymore. Instead, I rolled the window farther down and let the silence return. That strange quiet you only hear in places where a lot of people once screamed. I stepped out of the truck and clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark like a blade, revealing rows of short grass, scattered leaves, and the distant shapes of cannons pointed toward nothing. My boots crunched softly as I made my way toward the monument, checking for signs of vandalism or litter, just going through the motions. But every few seconds, I found myself looking back at the tree line. It felt like something was out there, watching. It wasn't a sound. Not exactly. More like the pressure in the air had changed. The kind of thing you notice with your skin before your brain catches up. And for the first time in years, I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, like I was being sized up by something that didn't quite belong. I shook it off, muttered something about needing more sleep, and walked back to the truck. As I opened the door, the radio crackled. A brief burst of static. I reached over to adjust the knob, and the narrator's voice faded back in. "Buried deep, beneath the very soil you now stand on. But remember, some pieces never found rest." The voice was different this time. Slower, more intimate, like it wasn't just reading a script anymore, but speaking directly to me. I stared at the radio, unmoving. My pulse quickened without permission. And then, silence. Not a cricket, not a rustle of leaves. The battlefield had gone completely still. I shut the door, locked it, and leaned back in the seat, eyes scanning the fading tree line. The dusk had finally slipped into full night. And somewhere out there, I could swear I saw the faintest flicker of green. Not a light, not a reflection. Eyes, watching me from the dark. There's a certain type of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels full, like the world's holding its breath. That's what settled over the battlefield at exactly 10 p.m. I'd been sitting in the truck for the past hour, scanning reports, drinking lukewarm coffee, and listening to the occasional hoot of an owl from somewhere deeper in the woods. But when I looked up, the trees were gone, swallowed by fog so thick it pressed against the windshield like wet cloth. It hadn't rolled in gradually, the way fog usually does. It just appeared. One moment, I could see the distant outline of the hilltop monument, and the next, the world outside the cab was a blank, gray void. I turned on the headlights, thinking I'd just head back early. But the beams didn't reach far, barely 20 feet before they were swallowed whole. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe a trick of light against wet leaves. But this glow, it moved, it hovered, shimmered, a faint, sickly green hue just beyond the reach of the truck's lights. Not a steady shine, but a pulsing flicker, like a lantern swinging in the wind. Except there was no wind. The trees didn't rustle. The air was dead still. I leaned forward, squinting. My instincts screamed to stay inside. Lock the doors, turn around and leave. But something stronger, curiosity, duty, or just plain stubbornness, pushed me to reach for the door handle. The air hit me like a wet towel, cold, heavy, and oddly metallic. I took a few steps from the truck, my boots crunching the gravel softly beneath me. I kept the flashlight down and my eyes forward, tracking the glow as it moved left, then right, then toward me. That's when the figure began to take shape. Out of the swirling fog came the outline of a man, tall, dressed in tattered gray. His coat hung from his shoulders in strips, and the long hem dragged across the dew-covered grass. But it wasn't until he stepped fully into the beam of the headlights that I saw what wasn't there. He had no head. Where his neck should have been, there was only shredded fabric, a broken collarbone jutting upward like a cracked branch. But from the chest upward, nothing. And yet, in the place where his eyes should have been, two emerald glows hovered, unblinking, steady, embedded deep in the empty sockets of air. I froze. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The figure walked slowly, not dragging its feet, not limping, just a steady, ghost-like glide across the battlefield grass. I wanted to back up, but my body refused. My knees locked. My mind refused to accept what I was seeing. The ghost stopped a few yards away. Then, in one eerily human motion, it tilted its invisible head, as if listening, or perhaps studying me. The green lights flickered, almost alive now, like a pulse. And then, it raised a hand. The sleeve of the uniform fell back, revealing an impossibly long arm of mottled flesh and yellowed bone. One finger extended, pointing behind me, into the thickest part of the fog. The air around us grew colder still, and then, it spoke. A voice that didn't belong to this world filled the air, like a whisper laced with thunder, echoing from the trees and beneath the ground. "Have you found it?" I gasped. The voice didn't come from its body. It didn't come from anywhere at all. It was as though the question had just existed, born fully formed in the space around me. My knees buckled. I stumbled backward, heart slamming in my chest like it was trying to escape. The figure didn't move, didn't come closer. It only watched, or listened, its glowing eyes locked on mine. And then, just as silently as it came, it was gone. One blink and the figure vanished, swallowed by the fog without a sound or a trace. The lights, the presence, everything, gone. But the fog itself had begun to lift now, rising slowly like smoke after a cannon blast. My truck sat behind me, untouched, just where I left it. And yet the feeling didn't fade. That pressure in the air, that presence. I forced myself to breathe again, to move, to make sure I hadn't just collapsed from exhaustion or lost my damn mind. That's when I saw it, right where the figure had pointed. Something was glinting in the grass. I don't remember falling. I just remember the cold. Wet grass soaking into my back. my chest heaving like I'd been underwater too long. My ears rang, and the world was a tunnel, the trees a blur, the fog lifting like someone had finally taken their finger off a pause button. The figure was gone. The emerald glow, those eyes, or whatever they were, had vanished. No footsteps, no sound, just me, sprawled on the edge of the battlefield, shaking like a leaf. But that wasn't the worst part, because right in front of me, just where the ghost had pointed, something glinted in the grass. I wanted to look away. Every part of me screamed to get back in the truck, lock the doors, call someone, anyone, and pretend none of this ever happened. But instead, I found myself crawling forward on hands and knees like a moth to a flame. It was metallic at first glance, catching just enough moonlight to shimmer through the dew. I reached out slowly, hesitantly brushing the tall blades of grass aside. Then I froze. It wasn't metal. It was bone. A partial skull shattered across one side, the cranium cracked clean through like a dropped porcelain bowl. Dust clung to it like the thing had been pulled straight from the earth, and something about the way it sat there, upright, waiting, made me feel like I wasn't the first to see it. And that wasn't even the worst part. Because when I leaned in closer, just close enough to see inside the hollow sockets, I saw it. That unmistakable shimmer of green. Not bright, not glowing. Just a faint, sickly tint, like the last breath of something still clinging to this world. My hand recoiled before I even realized I'd moved. My stomach turned. I wanted to scream, but my voice had retreated somewhere too deep to reach. I told myself, this is evidence. I needed to think like a ranger, like a professional. Something, anything, to anchor me in reality. This could be Civil War remains. There were rules for this. Protocol. I pulled a pair of latex gloves from the emergency kit in the truck and returned with a ranger-issued evidence bag. Carefully, without speaking, I lowered the skull inside, sealed it, and placed it in the back seat. Then I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The radio was still on, and then it crackled. Static, low at first, but rising. I leaned forward, trying to adjust the knob, but the dial spun on its own. The narrator's voice had long gone. What replaced it was something else entirely. A sound that came from behind the static, low, mournful, like a wind moving through empty graves. And under it, layered like something buried deep in the signal, a voice. Not mechanical, not recorded, something else. Have you found it? I punched the power button. The radio snapped off. Silence. I sat there in the dark, panting, heart still galloping, the skull a silent passenger behind me. I kept telling myself I'd imagined it all, that I was tired, that it was just a story, a hallucination, a coincidence. But I knew better. Because the battlefield had changed the moment I touched that skull. Something old, something restless had taken notice. It had waited a long time for someone to find it. And now, somehow, I had become part of its story. By the time I pulled into the ranger station lot, the sky was black, and the mist had thinned into a low crawl along the ground, like it hadn't fully given up the chase. I parked under the security light, half hoping the familiar buzz of the sodium lamp would bring some clarity to my thoughts. It didn't. The skull was still in the evidence bag, resting quietly on the passenger seat, like it had always belonged there. I stared at it for a long moment, my hand hovering over the zipper of the bag, debating whether to even bring it inside. Part of me wanted to dig a hole and bury the thing, let it rot where it lay. But the other part, the ranger in me, knew better. This was a potential historical find, a fragment of war, and it needed to be documented properly. So I brought it in. I logged it into the evidence catalog, or at least I tried to. The moment I typed skeletal remains, possible human skull, and hit enter, the computer froze. Not just lagged, froze solid. The mouse wouldn't move, the screen flickered twice, then went black. I rebooted, waited, tried again, same thing. The printer next to the desk spit out half a page of garbled ink, symbols and smudges like someone had jammed their palm on every key. No record, no paper trail, just static on the screen and that weird chill crawling up my spine again. So I gave up and jotted it down in the old ledger, the one we rarely used anymore, bound in green canvas and dust. As soon as I finished scribbling the note, the overhead lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. I told myself the grid was just glitching. Old building, poor wiring. That night, I stayed late. I shouldn't have. Around midnight, I heard the first door open. I was alone in the building, I knew that. The rest of the staff had left by 8, but I was in the office when I heard the unmistakable click of the back door latch opening, followed by a long, slow creak. I called out, "Hello?" Station's closed. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and crept into the hallway, every step echoing louder than it should have. The light flickered again. The air felt heavier. The door was wide open. Not ajar, not swinging. Wide open, as if someone had calmly walked through it, or never needed to use hands at all. I closed and locked it, trying to ignore the way my hand trembled against the deadbolt. As I turned to go back, something moved in the reflection of the hallway window. A blur. Faint. Green. When I checked, there was nothing there. The disturbances didn't stop. At 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert, the outdoor camera feed. I opened the app, expecting a deer or a raccoon sniffing around. Instead, it showed me, standing out in the middle of the lot, barefoot, still in my ranger uniform, motionless, head tilted slightly, the way the figure had done in the fog. But I hadn't left the building. I knew I hadn't. I checked the front door. Locked. My boots were by my desk. My keys were in my pocket. Still, there I was on the screen, standing in the fog for over 6 minutes before turning and walking back toward the trees. The feed ended. The image disappeared. I rushed to the window and stared into the dark, half expecting to see myself staring back. But nothing moved. The final straw came at 3:33 a.m. I woke up at my desk. I don't remember falling asleep. My phone was on the floor. The overhead light was buzzing again, and the evidence bag containing the skull was no longer under the desk where I left it. It was in the center of the room. The zipper had come undone. The skull had rolled slightly to the side, facing upward, and in the low, flickering light, the sockets glinted faint green. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When I checked my camera roll the next morning, I found over a dozen photos I hadn't taken. All black and green blurs, warped light, shadows shaped vaguely like a man in uniform. In one of them, my reflection stood in the window. But the eyes glowed. I don't know what I brought back with me from that battlefield, but it followed me here. And it's not done. The next morning, I looked like hell and felt worse. I hadn't really slept. Not that it would have made a difference. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the fog. I heard that voice again. "Have you found it?" Like it had been stitched into the folds of my brain. I knew I needed answers. There are files in the ranger station that most of the staff don't even know exist. Old stuff. Paper archives that predate digital logs, handwritten reports, faded memos, incident logs from a time when people still documented strange things without fear of being laughed out of a job. They keep those in the sub-level storage. I used my key, skipped breakfast, and went down. The air smelled like mold and dust and something metallic, like blood that had dried decades ago. I spent hours down there, flipping through brittle folders, scanning titles, missing items, paranormal claims, battlefield myths, recovered remains. Most were what you'd expect. Raccoon sightings mistaken for ghosts, tourists claiming to feel cold spots, some kid who swore he heard someone whisper his name during a tour. Harmless, silly. But then I found it. A manila folder, yellowed and soft at the corners, labeled Incident, 1983. Item lost. Human remains. The report inside was brief, typed in courier font on a stained page. A ranger named W. Dalton had logged finding a partial human skull near the eastern tree line. No lower jaw, damage consistent with cannon fire. He'd tagged it for preservation, submitted it to a nearby field museum, and never saw it again. The last line chilled me. Item went missing before cataloging. Storage locker 2B found open next morning. No signs of forced entry, no explanation offered. I flipped to the back and found a note, handwritten in blue ink, nearly illegible. Saw something in the fog. Same place. Eyes like fireflies. Not in the socket. In the air. Not right. Not right at all. The signature was smudged. The paper smelled faintly of ash. That wasn't the only file. There were dozens, scattered over decades. 1969, 1975, 1991. Sightings. Always at dusk. Always near the eastern ridge. Always a green light. The descriptions varied slightly, but one detail remained constant. No head. At one point, I found an old Polaroid, paperclip to a memo from the early 90s. It showed a foggy field, barely lit, but in the center, blurred and hunched, was a figure in gray, facing away. It had no visible head. The photo was labeled, "Old Green Eyes," in shaky handwriting. The deeper I dug, the more I found myself wondering why none of this was in the public archives. It was clear someone, or something, wanted this story forgotten. Around noon, I climbed the stairs back to the main floor and nearly collided with Roy, an old veteran who now volunteered at the visitor center. He was folding brochures, but he stopped when he saw my face. "You all right there, son?" he asked. "You look like you seen a ghost." I almost laughed, but the sound stuck in my throat. "Roy," I said. "You ever hear anything about a ghost soldier? Green eyes? Missing a head?" His expression shifted, slowly, carefully. The way someone looks when you've said something you weren't supposed to know. He nodded once, then put the brochures down. They called him Old Green Eyes. Yeah, tour folks love that one. Spooky story for the kids, but that ain't the real legend. I leaned in. Roy glanced around, even though the room was empty. Then he said, "The real version says it ain't just a ghost. It's a hunter. Was a Confederate officer, got decapitated by cannon fire. Body buried proper. Head never found. Locals said his spirit couldn't move on till he got put back together. Problem is, something changed. It stopped just looking." "What do you mean?" I asked, already knowing I didn't want the answer. Roy's voice dropped to a whisper. "I mean it started taking. Eyes, mostly. From deer, from dogs. Then, one night in the 80s, a ranger found a hiker dead in the woods. Skull crushed, eyes gone. They blamed an animal attack. No one talked about the green light seen near the body. He looked me straight in the eyes. "You bring something back from out there?" I couldn't speak. I didn't have to. Roy gave a slow, solemn nod. "Then you best find a way to give it back. Or it'll keep coming. Doesn't matter how far you run." That night, I couldn't eat. Couldn't think. I sat in the dark office, watching the skull on the shelf where I'd left it. The green in its sockets pulsed faintly now, like it was breathing. I didn't know if I was going mad or if the legend had wrapped its fingers around me for good. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. It was not done. I waited 3 nights before going back. 3 nights of barely sleeping, barely eating, barely functioning. Every night at 3:33, I'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat, convinced I'd heard the radio whispering from the kitchen or the bathroom or the closet, even though it wasn't on, even though it was unplugged. Everywhere I looked, I saw those eyes. Not bright, not blazing, just faint emerald pinpricks in the shadows, like something ancient watching through the veil. I knew I had to return the skull. Maybe it wouldn't fix anything. Maybe it was too late. But I couldn't keep carrying it around. Couldn't keep pretending I could outsmart whatever I had disturbed. So I wrapped the skull in a cloth, sealed it in a Ranger supply bag, and drove back to Chickamauga. It was a little past 9 when I reached the battlefield. The wind had died completely. The trees barely moved. The stars above were sharp and cloudless, too sharp, like they were watching, judging. I parked in the same pull-off beneath the oaks, near the cracked obelisk where it had all started. Every part of me tensed as I stepped out of the truck, expecting to hear the voice, to feel that static in the air. But the night remained still. For a while, I walked to the exact spot where I'd first seen him, the place where the fog had swallowed the field, where my headlights had captured that first unnatural glow. I set the bag down on the grass and backed away slowly, watching it like it might spring to life. And then, just as before, the temperature dropped. The air thickened, and the fog returned. Not a drifting mist this time, but a solid wall rolling low and fast, curling around my legs, rising like water from the ground itself. I stumbled backward, heart racing, mouth dry. And through the fog, it came. The same figure, the same uniform, torn, threadbare gray. No head, only that jagged collarbone and the empty void where a neck should be. But this time it didn't just appear, it formed. Rising from the mist, piece by piece, boots first, legs, torso, arms, and finally, the faintest shimmer. 2 floating green lights where the eyes should be, just above the empty neck. It approached slowly. No sound, no breath, just presence. It stopped near the bag, and then it knelt. The moment it touched the cloth, a low hum rippled through the fog. I felt it more than heard it. A vibration in my chest, like a far-off engine or a voice buried too deep to understand. The lights in its eye sockets pulsed. I watched, frozen, as it lifted the skull gently, reverently, as if it were something sacred. The green glow intensified, then dimmed again as it cradled the bone to its chest like a long-lost child. For the first time, I felt something almost human from it. Sorrow. It looked at me then. No face, no mouth, no expression. Just the glowing void of those impossible eyes. And slowly, step by step, it began to walk backward, deeper into the fog. Its body blurred with each pace, fading, softening. One step, then another, until it vanished entirely. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. My legs gave out and I dropped to my knees, hands clutching the damp earth. I whispered something, maybe a thank you, maybe a prayer. And then, I turned toward the truck and stopped cold. Across my windshield were dozens of green handprints, long, thin fingers trailing down the glass like melted wax. At the center, written in thick dew, were 2 words, not whole. That was when I understood. The skull wasn't the end. It was only a piece. There was something else, still missing. The next few days blurred. I tried returning to normal duty, logging visitor activity, updating trail maps, pretending I could step back into the daylight version of myself. But even in the sunniest hours, I could feel it. The weight behind me, just out of reach, as if the fog had burrowed into my bones and refused to leave. I kept thinking about the message on my windshield. Not whole. The skull wasn't enough. That much was clear. Whatever haunted Chickamauga wasn't finished. Not with the battlefield, and certainly not with me. It was an offhand remark from Roy, of all people, that finally gave me the clue. He was talking about the 1863 troop formations during a tour group's visit, and pointed to a barely visible ridge beyond the monument. Of course, they say there's a burial pit back there, unofficial. Old-timers never mapped it, but they sure as hell stayed away. A burial pit. I waited until everyone left. Then I took the field truck, a ground-penetrating radar kit we used for soil surveys, and hiked to the far side of the ridge. The area was overgrown, smothered in brambles and gnarled roots, nature's attempt to hide what didn't want to be found. I marked off a grid, powered up the radar, and began the sweep. It didn't take long. The screen bloomed with jagged shapes below the surface. Bones, dozens of them, scattered like a puzzle someone gave up on. Some lay orderly, others twisted, broken. But one caught my eye. No skull, just a body, torn uniform, shattered ribs, a burial, but rushed, violent. I stood directly above it, the machine buzzing low in my hands, when the air shifted again. that now familiar chill crawling up my neck like a breath I couldn't hear. The fog rolled in fast, not from the ground this time, but from within, from the trees, from nowhere. And then he was there, closer than before, clearer. The same Confederate uniform, the same ruined collar. But this time the ghost was vivid, almost solid, like he had drawn power from the soil itself. The green lights burned brighter in his empty sockets, not just watching me, but pleading. He raised a hand, not to threaten, but to reach, toward the grave. And then I understood. This wasn't just about being remembered. It was about being buried whole. Without thinking, I dropped to my knees and began clearing the soil. Not all of it, just enough to expose the shattered remains below. They were dry, ancient, but still tangled in the gray of a Confederate coat. I whispered something. I don't remember what. Maybe it was an apology. Maybe it was permission. The ghost knelt beside me, the first time he'd moved that way. He placed the skull I'd returned gently onto the crumbling chest, where it had once belonged. His fingers, skeletal, ethereal, brushed the bones like a man waking from a long, endless nightmare. Then, slowly, he stood. The green in his eyes pulsed once, then faded. And as I watched, his figure began to dissolve, not into fog, but into ash and memory, like dust returning to dust. He was gone. But something remained. A gust of wind knocked me back just as the earth trembled. Not a quake. More like a final breath. When I looked again, the bones were gone. All of them. The grave was empty. Only one thing remained, half buried in the mud. A tarnished bullet fragment, tinged faintly green. I pocketed it without thinking, though I sometimes wish I hadn't. A week later, I requested transfer from field duty. They gave me a desk in archives, a quiet room far from the trees and fog. I told myself I could leave it all behind if I just stayed indoors. No more night patrols, no more battlefield routes. But some nights, the radio in the storage room turns on by itself. Just static at first. Then, faintly, that whisper. Have you found it? And I realize, maybe not everything was buried. Not really.